All right, hello everyone. Can everyone in the back hear me? Thumbs up, great. Perfect. Well, welcome to our panel on democratic backsliding concerns in the year of elections. Given that we have over 60 countries holding elections in the year of 2024, we felt that it was very, very timely and important to have this conversation about protecting the right to free and fair elections and also protecting the integrity of democracy globally. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the International and Comparative Law Program here at GW and the George Washington International Law Review for co-sponsoring this event. And of course, I want to thank all of our excellent speakers today. So by way of introduction, we have Andrew Boyle, who is Senior Counsel at States United Democracy Center, where he works on accountability for democracy violators and rule of law planning. Andrew has previously worked as an attorney in both the Liberty and National Security Program and the Democracy Program of the Brennan Center for Justice, and he was a law clerk for a federal appellate judge. Internationally, Andrew has investigated and prosecuted atrocity crimes at the Kosovo Specialist Prosecutor's Office and the UN Assistance to the Khmer Rouge trials, and worked in the trial chambers of the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Among other roles, he serves on the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law. Down on the other end, we have David Levine, who is a foremost expert in electoral integrity and security, committed to ensuring that elections are free, fair, and trusted by the public. With a JD from Case Western Reserve University School of Law, David has built a career centered on safeguarding democracy, with his insights featured in major outlets like The Hill, BBC, and USA Today. Throughout his career, David has taken on pivotal roles, including serving as the elections director in Ada County, Idaho, and as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Alliance for Securing Democracy. Beyond these roles, he is an adjunct professor at George Mason University and a key contributor to several advisory boards dedicated to election security. He also observes elections around the world for entities such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Carter Center. And then in the middle, we have Annika Silva-Leander, who is head of North America at International IDEA, where she oversees International IDEA's outreach in the region, including relations with U.S. government agencies, democracy assistance organizations, and academic institutions, its engagement with the United Nations, and coordination of the Global Democracy Coalition. She is International IDEA's permanent observer to the United Nations, representing International IDEA at the UN General Assembly as a leading voice and advocate on democracy. She heads International IDEA's offices in both DC and New York, and as an opinion builder on democracy, she also contributes to the global democracy debate through her analysis and speaking engagements on the state of democracy globally in the context of the UN and other global fora of relevance to the global democracy discussions. She has served in various roles with IDEA, and prior to joining International IDEA in 2015, she worked for 10 years at the World Bank on civic engagement and poverty reduction in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So we are very grateful to have all of these wonderful speakers join us today. And to kick off the discussion for today, I'm going to direct my first question to Annika. So Annika, can you speak a little bit to what some of the concerning trends are that we are witnessing in the world's recent elections?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here. Maybe before I go into providing the context, just a bit more information on what International IDEA is, the organization that I represent here in DC and in New York. We are a small intergovernmental organization. We have 35 member states, most of them democracies, although some of them are unfortunately backsliding. So we are an intergovernmental organization, but we call ourselves a think and a do tank. So we conduct policy relevant research on democratic strengthening, but we also provide capacity building and technical assistance to democratic stakeholders, both in government, electoral commissions, civil society, and the media, mainly in newer democracies. Since 2017, we produce our flagship report, the Global State of Democracy Report. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I encourage you to do so. Just 2 days ago, we published the report for this year, and it's called Strengthening the Legitimacy of Elections in a Time of Radical Uncertainty. It provides a global overview of global and regional democratic trends, but it also looks at one of the defining policy issues of our time, in our view, which is what drives the credibility of electoral processes globally and the growing mistrust that we are seeing towards elections in many parts of the world. Before I go into providing sort of the global context in which this super cycle election year is happening, just some basic statistics on this super cycle election year. Because International IDEA, one of the key areas that we work on is electoral processes. So we provide an overview and we monitor this super cycle election year, but we work on these processes, of course, also outside of this super cycle election year. So we have 73 national elections that are happening around the world this year, in every region of the world, and it's called a super cycle election year because the number of elections that are happening this year is more than the average number of elections that normally happen every year. Normally you have around 50 to 60 national elections that are happening around the world, but this year it's well beyond that. And I think the other defining feature of this super cycle election year is that the elections are happening in many different kinds of democracy, both in small microstates, like Tuvalu is a small Pacific island, 11,000 inhabitants, but also large democracies that are geopolitically powerful, like India and the US, which also have a large population size. Together, they have 1.7 billion people. So by the end of this year, almost 3 billion voters would have been called to the polls. Not all of them vote, unfortunately, but they would have been called to the polls. So far, and we're in September now, 54 of those national elections have been held. So we have a few more to go, around 20 to go, and of course, an important one, which for here and for the world, I would say the US elections. I'm going to let David talk about some specific developments that have happened during this year, during the super cycle year, but I'm going to give a little bit of context to provide an overview of what is the global context in which this super cycle election year is happening. And it draws from our Global State of Democracy report. So you will have heard that this super cycle election year is occurring in a global context of global democratic decline. We base our report on a number of data sets. The statistical data sets that we use is called the Global State of Democracy Indices. It has a bit of a lag, like most statistical data sets have, so the data goes until the end of 2023. And by the end of 2023, you had 2023 was basically the 8th consecutive year, according to our measurement, in which there was a global democratic decline that we define as more countries experiencing a decline in at least one of their indicators of democracy versus the countries that were experiencing advances. And this is the longest consecutive stretch of years that we see this decline. And there are a number of other measurements out there. I'm sure you're familiar with Freedom House. They define a longer time stretch. They say that it's the 18th consecutive year. But I think the difference is that we're using different methodologies, different measurements, different indicators. But what we agree on is that it's the longest consecutive stretch, and that there is a global democratic decline that is defining this historical moment that we find ourselves in, that breaks the expansion, the democratic expansion that we had seen in the world since the 1970s, what is called the third wave of democratization. According to our data, almost half of the countries in the world have experienced democratic decline in the last 5 years. Only 1 in 4 countries is making some progress on their democratic performance. And maybe I should also say that we measure democracy according to 4 key dimensions of democracy. One is representation, the other one is rights, the third one is rule of law, and the fourth one is participation. And then we have sub-indicators under these 4 categories, a total of 30 indicators. And when we look at the data, and we look at what the data told us 6 years ago, at the time I was leading the Global State of Democracy report, we started to see this global democratic decline. But at the time, the declines that we saw were very concentrated in the area of rights. So we saw attacks on freedom of expression, on press freedom, and we saw shrinking civic space in many countries. Now what we see is that the declines that we're seeing in many countries are expanding beyond the rights dimensions to also affect the dimension of representation. And specifically under the dimension of representation, the indicators of credible elections and effective parliament. Actually, the 2023 was the worst year on record when we look at the number of countries that were declining on these two indicators. And the declines that we are seeing span both traditionally strong democracies, matured, older democracies, but also newer democracies that are more fragile. Now, before I hand over to my colleagues here on the panel, just a few of the electoral trends in particular that we are seeing in our report. So I said that the supercycle election year is happening in a context where the democratic context is worsening, but the quality of elections is also declining. If we look at 10 years ago, 38 countries in the world had low levels of electoral credibility. When we look at that today, it's 50 countries. And so it's a quarter of the countries in the world. And many of these countries have experienced military coups. They are on the rise, which is where you see these countries with mid-range levels of electoral quality of elections going into the low levels. Some of them are Myanmar, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali. So the decline in electoral quality is going hand in hand with rising authoritarianism on one hand. In 2023, we saw 39 countries experiencing significant declines in their credible election score. So that means that 1 out of 3 voters casting a ballot this year is doing so in countries where the election quality is worse than 5 years ago. We see many of these declines happening in Africa. Actually, most of the declines are happening in Africa, but we also see declines in other regions of the world, actually in all regions of the world, including Europe, Asia, and the Americas. In parallel to this trend in the decline in the quality of elections, we also see decline in the trust in elections. And we did a perception survey earlier this year. We looked at 19 countries and we looked at how people perceive democracy and elections. And in 11 out of the 19 countries that we surveyed, less than half of the respondents expressed confidence in the most recent election. And in 17 out of the 19 countries, less than 2/3 of respondents had confidence in the most recent election. So it is really a global phenomenon. And when you put this together, and I'll stop here for this first point, so you have declining quality of elections and less public confidence in elections. It's not surprising that there are more protests and riots related to elections. So we have seen that those increasing. So there is what we see in our report, and one of the key findings is that there is, over the last couple of years, an increase in the number of contested elections around the world. Almost 20% of elections between 2020 and 2024. One of the losing candidates or parties rejected the results around the world. And elections are being decided by court appeals at the same rate. So most of the disputes that we see, and I think this is important for the rest of the conversation, is related to voting irregularities and vote counting. And this goes for, it's the global trend. And while many of these declines are concentrated in countries with low levels of electoral credibility to start with, we also see democracies of higher quality where disputes have been observed, including here in the United States, but also countries like Brazil and Poland, which used to have also high levels of electoral credibility. And in the mid-range spectrum, you have countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Guatemala, and Malawi, where we have seen disputes. The other key finding, and I'll stop here, is that voter turnout is decreasing, and that's another key challenge, that it has decreased by 10 percentage points globally. So it has gone down from 65% in 2008 to 55% in 2023. So while we're seeing a decline in voter turnout, we're also seeing an increase in protests around elections. They have increased from 4% in 75 to 28% in 2023. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to you, Leah.
Great. Thank you so much, Annika. So as Annika just mentioned, we have already seen roughly 50 of these elections take place in this year. So David, we're more than halfway through the year. What have been some of the major wins for democracy, and what have been some of the major setbacks, failures, if you will? Thank you.
No, Leah, I appreciate your having me here, and Annika, I appreciate you teeing this up, quite frankly. When Annika prosecutes the case, it's pretty impenetrable, and so this part, I imagine, will frankly, what I'm going to share here will probably be a little more controversial, and I expect there'll be a little bit of pushback, perhaps not only from my panelists, but perhaps from you. I think Annika did a really good, solid job, and that report that our organization put out 2 days ago was one, again, to foot stomp. People ought to check out if they haven't already. But she did a really good job of sort of setting the stage up until, right, through the end of 2023. I think as we come here, and as I was preparing sort of for the presentation, I mean, there are folks that have painted a picture, I think, that is pretty glum. I'm inclined, right, to think that the picture thus far, right, about 2/3 of the way through or 50 elections through, is a little bit more mixed, right, with regards to elections. And sort of I say that for a couple reasons, right? I think that elections to sort of, have been, the elections that we've seen thus far have largely fallen into 3 buckets. And again, I welcome sort of the feedback that you all have, but I think what we have, 3 trend lines that we've seen to date is that we have largely seen that in consolidated democracies, where democracy is basically the only show in town, that elections have generally been run okay. Right? Doesn't mean they've been perfect. Doesn't mean we haven't seen incremental gains or gains that have been made, right? Particularly sort of on the right when we're talking about elections like in the EU parliamentary elections. But then there are elections where they're in countries that are somewhere between this sort of stable democracy and we'll call it consolidated autocracy, right? And I think examples of that, which we could sort of talk to a little bit about, could be sort of in that Indonesia, right? Pakistan might potentially sort of be in that category. Those are examples of a couple places where I think we could talk about a little bit more, where we've had a little bit more sort of backsliding as a result of their election. But we've also seen some that have moved, I think, in the right direction. I think of, for example, Hungary having its elections in the EU parliamentary elections and seeing some of the surprising results, right, from what they meant for Fidesz as a result of that sort of election. And then I think about that third category are in countries that are pretty firmly sort of autocratic, where they have repressive rulers. And, not surprisingly, we saw results that didn't reflect the democratic will of the people. And we can think about Russia, we can think about Belarus, we can think about El Salvador, and I'll, just to sort of go through just a few of them, and then I want to, frankly, hear more from Andrew and my colleagues, because that's going to be more exciting than hearing from me. But let me just go through, I think, sort of a few of them here for you all. Even when I put those 3 categories there, right, there's still a mixed picture when we think about them, right? So, when I think about wins for democracy, there are at least 2 tests as sort of an election integrity sort of specialist that I think about. Number 1, is the election conducted in what might be genuinely democratic or free and fair manner, right? That reflects the will of the people, right? As a former election official, that means, is there adequate opportunity for people to access the ballot? Are people going to trust it? Is it going to be secure? But the second piece, which some of you may also be thinking about, is even if the election is conducted, right, in a free and fair manner, if that results in getting somebody who doesn't necessarily believe in free and fair elections coming into power, then what does that sort of mean, right? And so I'm attempting, when I make these categories, to think about both of those pieces. And so, when I think about the European parliamentary elections, I do think that the elections were conducted in a free and fair manner. I do think there were some gains made by some folks on the right, but even in those populist parties that perhaps may have had anti-democratic tendencies, from where I sit, I don't think that there's an imminent subversion of the election process happening with regards to EU parliamentary elections. Certainly there were efforts by some democratic actors, also by foreign adversaries, Russia, China, and others, to interfere, but nothing happened there. When I think about another sort of democratic success, just as sort of another example, and I'll just touch on a few, and I welcome others to bring to the fore. I think about what happened in an election I observed in July in the UK. Now, on the one hand, it was a snap election. It happened more quickly than it should have. There were some issues, right, in terms of mail ballots, getting them out to voters. There was a voter ID requirement that had a little bit of implementation issues. But generally, this was an election that reflected the will of the people, right, and now has a government in place that, has perhaps not gone in that sort of more rightward trend. It is worth noting, to a point that Annika raised, that there was a decline in overall voter turnout in that election. I think it was about 60% of eligible voters casting their ballots. It's the lowest rate since 2001, and that compares with a record, I think, of about 83% in the 1950 general election. So again, even when I think about these success stories, it's a more nuanced approach. If we go beyond Europe, because I don't want to just be Europe-centric, other positive examples I think about are Senegal, right, and its March presidential vote, both in terms of who, of course, came to power, somebody that sort of ran on a platform in terms of being an outsider and an anti-corruption candidate, but also, as probably many of you know in this room, there was, the incumbent talked about delaying the elections and potentially imprisoning or disqualifying other candidates. And of course, there had been neighboring countries where we had seen, coups that had been undertaken. And so I think, again, there had been a fright, there had been a potential constitutional crisis, but elections went ahead, and now you have the youngest democratically elected president in Africa, over there. Other couple elections where, again, we had success, Taiwan and their ability to push back on efforts by PRC to interfere in the election. And then I mentioned sort of Hungary and what happened in June. There are others that we could perhaps talk about, but in the interest of time, for example, like what France had following the European parliamentary elections, but I want to make sure I come to some of what we call the major losses for democracy. And again, folks may take issue, with the major part of this, because they sort of might say to themselves, well, some of these countries I'm going to list aren't necessarily places that were such havens for democracy to begin with. But I think they're ones that are worth noting. I might put Venezuela in this category. Again, it appeared that Venezuela's opposition turned out in great enough numbers to warrant a victory. The U.S. Secretary of State and other international leaders seem to suggest that the evidence suggested that. We're going to see where things end up, but right now, as far as I know, unless somebody's got something up on their phone, the incumbent is staying in power. I think we talked about others where, again, this is sort of being a bit of an issue, where we talked again about in terms of sort of losses for democracy. Indonesia and Pakistan, I think, are both ones that sort of come to mind. And another one that perhaps is a more mixed bag on this, where we sort of talk about a loss potentially, and again, I welcome pushback, is with regards to Bangladesh. On the one hand, you saw an incumbent win, On the other hand, there were protests, obviously violent, but there was obviously a movement that led to that leader to, of course, exit the stage. And so, I think, these are some examples, again, of places where we had sort of major victories, losses, and then of course, sort of stuff in between. Happy to sort of talk about more examples, interested in what both my colleagues as well as others think, but hopefully that gives us a jumping off point of sorts.
Great, thank you, David. And then my next question will be directed to Andrew. So what are the connections between democratic backsliding and international legal principles and obligations? And then what does accountability look like for election interference and violation of these processes?
Thank you for those questions. Thanks also for having me here today. Thank you for letting me join my co-panelists, and thank you all for coming and being concerned about these issues. These are very important issues, and democracy is a team sport, as they like to say, and so I hope that you all will find some space in your personal, professional careers to get involved in promoting democracy. I will follow Annika's example just to tell you briefly about the organization that I work for now, States United Democracy Center. We're a relatively new organization, and we work domestically here in the United States, partnering with state-level officials. We are nonpartisan. We will work with any state-level official that is interested in promoting democracy and wants to work with us. So primarily we work with governors' offices and attorney generals in assisting them in various election issues. I'm on a team at States United that, amongst other things, works on accountability for individuals that may have attempted to interfere with democratic processes in the United States. And I'll talk a bit about that in the second question that Leah asked about accountability. In terms of the sort of international legal basis for accountability, I think the first point to make is that democracy itself is well and firmly grounded in international law. So you have in treaties such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, articles that guarantee rights to democracy, to fair elections, importantly, to genuine elections. So not just window dressing, as we sometimes see, and as my professionals to my left will be able to talk about. I think that autocrats around the world in the last few decades have gotten better at putting up sham elections so that they satisfy and check certain boxes that are not genuine elections. And that is not what the law talks about. The law talks about having genuine elections. These core democratic rights are also contained in regional treaties, regional conventions. So the Inter-American Convention, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, all contain democracy protective language. And the UN General Assembly has also has held votes and put out resolutions that define the elements of democracy. But stepping outside this sort of cut and dry issue of just whether democracy is protected by international law, it's important to note that as Annika and David were speaking, you might have heard them talking about the courts, about freedom of the press, about other issues. And democracy is really an umbrella that sits above a whole bunch of other rights that you need to have a functioning democracy. And those rights as well are protected in international law. So, as I mentioned, you have rights to an independent judiciary. You have rights protected in international law to a free press. You have rights protected in international law to freedom of assembly, which are so important to, for example, labor unions, to political parties even. Rights to run for office, obviously with certain parameters within the particular country. Certain parameters are allowed. In the United States, you have to be, for certain offices, you have to be above a certain age and you have to be born an American citizen. So it's not an absolute right in every respect, but there needs to be some right to do that. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom that promote transparency. These are also important. So there's been some mention of Hungary already. There's, Viktor Orban has used licensing in Hungary to repress press outlets that do not agree with his political party. And so already you see some deterioration there in the political democracy ecosystem, where you have judges that are not able to appropriately rule on outcomes. And as we already heard, elections are increasingly becoming contested. And so therefore, the people that are making the decisions about elections become much more important. And of course, the right to vote. And so ensuring that the franchise is not only as broad as possible, but as accessible as possible, I think is very important. And that is also contained in international law. And then the final group of laws internationally that I want to just point to very quickly are laws that protect some of the symptoms and instigators of democratic backsliding. So there are international treaties that protect against racism, and racism is a driver of democratic backsliding. There are international treaties such as CEDAW that protects against that protects the equality of gender rights. And inequality is a driver of democratic backsliding. You also have rights regarding economic opportunity, against excessive executive power, and autocracy in that regard. So that set of laws is also very important in upholding democracy. And you also have interpretations of all of these treaties. So for example, with the ICCPR, you have the UN Human Rights Committee that's also providing interpretations and robust interpretations of those resolutions. And then I'll also just mention that, part of, as many in this room will know, part of international law is customary international. Customary international law, it doesn't have to be contained in a treaty if it's customary. And in that regard, it's very important for states to speak out about what they believe the customary law of democracy is, because it's a groundswell of sufficient states opining as to what the law of democracy is, that forms customary international law and then can be pointed to in courts and other missives and reports to show what the basic tenets of democracy are. I'll just mention, so for example, interference in other people's elections, country-to-country interference, that's an area that is ripe for countries to speak out and say that violates international law, because that's an area where creating customary international law will be very helpful. I'll speak briefly to your second question about the avenues for accountability. And I think that framing it as accountability as opposed to sort of one slice of accountability, such as prosecutions or something like that, is important because there are many forms of accountability. You've already heard some of them. The report that Annika's organization just put out, that is a form of accountability. States care about how they are portrayed in well-respected international organizations, what people are saying about them, what people are saying about their democracy. That's a form of accountability. Of course, the preeminent form of accountability is elections themselves. That is accountability. That is people voting, if they are able to, for individuals that are trying to uphold democracy versus those that are not trying to uphold democracy. And so that is also a form of accountability. That's not to say that there aren't more traditional forms of accountability, such as prosecution. So this goes back to some of my work here domestically. We've seen in the United States criminal prosecutions of individuals for various attempts to subvert democracy, whether that's interfering with electoral counts, putting forward false slates of electors. We've seen civil actions against individuals. We've seen attempts, at least for the lawyers that were involved in this, to have them disbarred, often successfully, in that regard. So there's domestic accountability in that regard. We saw an impeachment, although it resulted in an acquittal. So there's accountability in that regard. But then also at the international stage, there's other opportunities for accountability. So even if individuals challenge within their own court systems and are not satisfied with the results of those challenges, you have regional bodies to which they can bring other challenges to say, my rights because of my country's position within this regional organization have been violated. So you have the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, you have the European Court on Human Rights, you have the UN Human Rights Committee that complaints can be brought to. David mentioned election observation missions, which he has participated in. That is a form of accountability, that having outsiders on the ground observing elections and saying, yes or no on whether the processes are appropriate. And then obviously governments and civil society have the opportunity to name and shame democracy violators, and in terms of governments to actually impose sanctions. So there's the opportunity to put financial sanctions to adjust, whether it's various trade items, what have you, if a particular state is not living up to the democracy norms of that state that's imposing those sanctions, or a group of states. And I think in this area, it's important for democracies to bind together and have joint action, because obviously the statements they make in that regard are all that more significant. I'll stop.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. So that kind of brings me to the next question, because I think some of this is a little bit cyclical, a little circular. But that being said, question to all of you, what are some of the main preemptive protective mechanisms that governments as well as the international community have available to prevent election interference, and are they effective? I think Andrew touched on this a little bit, so if you want to maybe just mention the effectiveness. Want to go down the whole thing? Yeah.
In terms of interference with foreign interference with elections, I think that yes, there are. I think accountability is key to that. Sort of the idea that there will be consequences for attempting to interfere with elections is a strong signifier that that it shouldn't be done again, or that there will be consequences if it's done again. I think that sanctions work is important. I think binding together to have various states working on whether that's cybersecurity or creating other mechanisms, such as the European Union's recent AI treaty that can control and place rules around how these technologies might be used to interfere in elections is important. And then I think also educating the public generally in order to be able to spot interference when it's happening is also a very important part of the equation.
Yeah, I think thank you for these very interesting insights. And I should start by saying that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm coming at this from a political science perspective, which hopefully will add value to the conversation. Maybe before I go into looking at some of the mechanisms to preempt interference, I think it's important to also unpack a little bit the concept of electoral interference. And I try to do it. We normally, generally in IDEA, which is a democracy assistance organization, we use it in relation to foreign electoral interference. But I think that there are different forms of electoral interference, also domestic, and here in the US context, I think it's very relevant. So I identified sort of three broad categories. They are not grounded in academic analysis, but my own experience of what I see around the world. So I'm sure it has some gaps. But one is when you have election interference by a government, and generally it's in authoritarian context that happens, and it can involve both controlling the electoral environment in favor of the government, like for example in Venezuela, as well as outright fraud, Russia or Belarus, but other countries as well that have held elections this year. And that can happen either through voter list manipulation or ballot stuffing or both. And you can have electoral interference in both the electoral environment as well as the day of elections with ballot stuffing and manipulation of different kinds. It can also express itself in this first category in the form of refusal to accept election results, I think, by the losing candidate in a free and fair election. Important to differentiate between authoritarian context and democratic context. I think the second category is more subtle forms of election interference, and in a context of the title of this discussion, I think are important to emphasize, which is in the context of democratic backsliding. And democratic backsliding refers to democratic countries that have, at least initially, governments that have been voted through free and fair elections, and that then, once voted into power, implement reforms, use their parliamentary majorities to implement reforms that end up weakening or undermining democracy. And in those contexts, the more subtle forms of interference, you don't see them on election day, and it's not direct rigging or voter manipulation, but it's generally through electoral reforms that happen well before the election. For example, in Hungary, you mentioned the case of Hungary. Over a course of several years, a number of reforms, including constitutional reforms, that have tilted the playing field in favor of the governing party, Fidesz, including gerrymandering, for example, that also tilts the elections in favor of the Fidesz party. I think another form of subtle election interference is also when governments implement election reforms very close to an election. That is not generally recommended. One case, and that's also a democratic backsliding case, which is now in a reversal mode, which is one of the hopeful examples this year, is Poland. But during the pandemic, for example, very close to the elections, they tried to implement electoral reform to introduce all postal elections. Very controversial, and it was seen as a move by the government to try to tilt in favor of the governing party. And they ended up losing in the elections that happened early this year. Third category is foreign electoral interference, which refers to the deliberate efforts by foreign governments or non-state actors to influence the outcome of another country's and integrity of another country's elections. And it's generally done through disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, but also through financial influence or manipulating voter perception. So what I wanted to do to answer the second part of your question, which is what can be done preemptively, I'm going to focus on what the international community can do, and I'm sure David will go into what can be done also domestically in some of these cases. But I think in the first case of domestic electoral interference in authoritarian context, but also in backsliding context, democracy assistance organization like International IDEA have an important role to play. Not necessarily the day of the election. We actually don't conduct electoral observation the day of the election, but we do long-term work where we build, for example, the capacity of civil society organizations. That is easier to do in democratic backsliding context, bit more difficult in authoritarian context. So we have to adopt creative strategies in those contexts where we support civil society organizations in country when they are allowed to operate, but also democracy activists and civil society that increasingly so operate outside of the country in exile, as the number of authoritarian regimes is increasing and their level of repression is increasing. I think another tactic is to support also within civil society is support domestic electoral observation group. Citizen observation is something that IDEA supports in a number of countries, for example, in Sierra Leone, in Mozambique, and a number of other contexts, and many of our peer organizations, such as, for example, NDI and IFES, they also support such efforts. Media, you talked about the media, and I think that is also very important, supporting independent media, both in-country, national media, local media, very important. But in a lot of authoritarian contexts, media is increasingly controlled by the government, and is not able to report freely. So international media has an important role to play in terms of reporting and creating awareness, international awareness, as well as domestic awareness about potential electoral risks. Here I'm talking about preemption, right? So how can we prevent electoral interference? But I would say that the international community generally comes in when it comes to, for example, electoral observation or other independent assessment missions. For example, the UN has conducted independent assessment missions now in the context of Venezuela. Those efforts often come in too late. It's not the prevention part, but it's, electoral observation on the day of the election. Of course, they look at the pre-electoral context, but the reports come out after the elections. And of course, in a number of authoritarian contexts, electoral observation, international observation is not allowed or very restricted. In the Venezuelan elections, only the Carter Center was allowed. But the UN here comes in and has a role to play. We saw 2 independent assessment missions by the UN. They don't do electoral observation, but they provide an assessment of the human rights situation pre-elections, in the pre-electoral context and the post-electoral context. And I think that the presence of international observers, when they are allowed, and independent assessment missions by the UN, they can be effective to some extent. Not that they have been in the case of Venezuela, but they can create some pressure on governments by signaling that the electoral process is being watched internationally. Now, I'll just end by talking about foreign electoral interference as the other category and what the international community can do there. And you mentioned some already, but I think democracy assistance organizations such as International IDEA and others have an important role to play in documenting international good practices when it comes to fighting foreign interference in election, and also convening stakeholders to share experiences. I think when it comes to foreign electoral interference, what is so interesting is that it affects democracies old and new to the same extent. And so International IDEA works a lot on this. For example, we've published reports where we document experiences in cybersecurity protections, in implementing cybersecurity protections to protect against electoral interference. And we have case studies from all over the world where mature democracy, OECD countries can learn from newer democracies that are facing similar challenges. And the learning goes both ways. I think we also have an important role to play as democracy assistance organizations to document effective legal frameworks that penalize and aim to penalize foreign and domestic actors involved in election interference. There are a number of examples. For example, in Australia, the Foreign Interference Act criminalizes foreign meddling in elections. And such legal frameworks can play a role in terms of deterring interference. But their effectiveness, when we talk about effectiveness, they really depend on enforcement and international cooperation, because these are issues that stretch across national boundaries. Democracy assistance organizations also have an important role to play in tracking disinformation campaigns. The Alliance for Securing Democracy, for example, at the German Marshall Fund provides a very good example. They track foreign interference in elections around the world and provides critical independent information on this. We also work a lot on building the capacity of electoral commissions, civil society actors, and media in newer democracies to identify foreign electoral disinformation, which is sometimes hard to identify. So we work with actors in newer democracies to help them identify such threats. And then just finally, I mean, you spoke a little bit about the EU. The EU as a regional organization has an important role to play also in countering foreign electoral interference, and they are doing a lot of things already, both in terms of regulations, but also they have a lot of practical initiatives. For example, the East Stratcom Task Force that was established in 2015 exposes and raises awareness of pro-Kremlin disinformation. They have similar task forces for other regions of the world. The EU also has a disinformation database where they have debunked over 16,000 disinformation instances. They also have, the EU has a rapid alert system since 2018, which allows EU institutions and member states to quickly exchange information and plan responses to disinformation campaigns. So these are some of the measures that can be taken. You also spoke about sanctions. I think that is another, it's not preemptive though, it's after the fact, can also be a tactic to sanction countries that have committed interference after it's been done. Mixed record on the effectiveness of those sanctions, however. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you, David.
I think my colleagues were pretty thorough, so I'm gonna do a couple things here. One is I'll try and provide a few things for you all on this. I know that I gave some video remarks last week to the International Republican Institute's Generation Democracy Network at their global summit, right? And in terms of preventing, we know that when there's high voter turnout, that can be one of the best ways at times to push back sort of against election interference. For those of you, and again, this will be a little plug on the domestic side of things my colleagues talked about, but if you aren't sure of what you're doing for election day or beforehand and you're interested in being an election worker and serving on the front lines, it's a critical way to deal with some of the sort of threats and attacks that we're seeing on election workers and even on some of the election infrastructure at polling places. And then the third thing, which again, I think, keeping in mind the caveats that my colleagues mentioned, and happy to touch more on this, is sort of, while election observation won't be a prevention of a whole number of things, it can perhaps prevent certain kinds of election interference. For example, if somebody were to try and subvert the process of a piece of voting equipment, again, at a particular polling place, the ability to be there, to observe, to potentially serve as a deterring effect, can be a really important thing. So the ability to vote, potentially be a poll worker or serve as an observer, points that, frankly, they're not just, they're not mine, they're not original. Jen Easterly with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency has been, for example, bandying those about for quite some time. And so I think, those things are really important. I think it's also important, too, to touch on something that both Andrew and Annika mentioned, and perhaps in retrospect, it's a little on me for not clearing it up before when we spoke, is when I think about election interference, I actually think about it a little more narrowly, and this gets at this sort of point. I have a definition that's perhaps a little more like the U.S. intelligence community, which is sort of along the lines of, it's a fraction of these election influence activities that can target technical aspects of the election, such as voter registration, We think about Russian interference efforts, to sort of breach voter registration databases in 2016, or I think about trying to interfere perhaps in the casting and the counting of ballots, or frankly the reporting of the results, and we can sort of talk about other countries where we've sort of seen that kind of thing. I think that's, for me, partially, I'm a bit biased because I'm a former election official myself, but that's sort of, to me, a little more of election interference as opposed to sort of what I think of as election influence, which are other things that could perhaps be done to change your mind or my mind or others about how we might go about sort of, deciding who we might vote for, whether that, again, are things like deep fakes. And I think there was perhaps an event maybe earlier today at GW, that was on that front? Okay. Where I obviously saw some folks like Daniel Weiner and others who I'm sure had plenty to say on that. But I think, again, in the interest of time, I think mainly just to sort of indicate some things that I think folks can still do if they haven't figured out what they want to do yet. sort of thinking about, and then thinking about, again, what you can do around that sort of definition of election interference. A couple of things that I think that are important on the prevention side. The intelligence collection matters. I think, again, I don't mean to harp on the U.S. in 2016, but it's just the example that comes to mind. I think about the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. government didn't come out with talking about Russian interference till October of that year, they actually learned about Russian interference efforts earlier on in the election cycle, thanks to, intel from countries, particularly the Netherlands. And so I think the importance of being able to share, and share intelligence is important. I think the importance of being able to have both physical monitoring and cyber monitoring of election infrastructure matters, right? Again, I feel a little funny talking about just the U.S. There are other countries that are doing this as well, but I think about having sensors that are looking at sort of any irregular network activity. We know, and again, this is something that our intelligence community has sort of spoken about, we know that Russia is perhaps the main driver, of foreign actors trying to interfere. We know that this is sort of, this is certainly something within their scope. We know that, Iran is sort of thought about a little bit this sort of cyber adjacent influence campaigns. We know that there've been, again, that the PRC may not necessarily be interested in breaching the election according to intel communities, but they may be interested in down ballot races, and they of course have been trying to do things perhaps in other countries' elections even more directly, like Taiwan. And so I think that's of note. And again, this is a little funny. This is such an Annika. Post-election audits are something that you do afterwards, right? But if you are announcing that you are doing them on the front end, there's an interesting question about whether that can potentially have a deterrent effect, right? You have the ability to identify in the event that there were to be a breach of a piece of election infrastructure. If you have, a paper record that you could go back to, you could be able to see a discrepancy and then think about whether you're going to get in, again, doing some of what we saw in terms of investigations, looking at things like, again, we talk about sanctions and whatnot. Just a couple other quick things, and I really do want to turn it over. The forceful government response matters, whether we're talking about combating election interference or disinformation. I think when I think about countries where, I think about some European countries that I think help deter some Russian efforts to interfere. We think about Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden. There was a very sort of clear message about not tolerating interference in the elections. I think about a cross-partisan message. I think about France ahead in sort of 2017 elections, being able, notwithstanding, what was tried to be done in that election, but I think the fact that you sort of saw folks across the political spectrum, say something. And I think, the other thing that was sort of important and noteworthy is having vigorous, on the prevention side, sort of public awareness campaigns. Finland, I think, is sort of particularly among one example of those that are well known, but I also think of sort of comprehensive civic education programs. I helped teach a course at George Mason very quickly that not only teaches election security, but those kids, some of them will go on and they'll take the class, and then they will actually be able to go and be housed at Virginia election offices where they'll help bring up their cyber bona fides so that they're in a better place to meet evolving threat actors, that has both an educational as well as a cyber component.
Very cool. Thank you. And I also kind of want to add that I feel like everything is kind of preemptive, because even if it's post one election, it is also inherently pre another. So everything that was just spoken about is very important. And like I said, it's a cyclical notion of elections and democracy. As long as it continues, it's all important. So my last question would be, what should be our biggest concern regarding the state of election integrity and the right to free and fair elections globally? And then if anyone wants to add in some final thoughts before we open it up for questions from the audience. You want to go in reverse order? David, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll be right off the bat. Just real quick things, and other my colleagues can jump in. So one is, my concerns are, again, I touched on this earlier, in autocracies where elections have been held. I feel like in a number of places we're seeing the grips, those rulers be affirmed, or even sort of strengthened. I think about Belarus, I mentioned Russia, Bangladesh, El Salvador. These are countries where there doesn't appear to be, sort of a lot of necessarily sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. I think about countries that are hovering again between something Thomas Carruthers at Carnegie sort of spoke about, this sort of stable democracy and consolidated autocracy, this concern about going the other direction, for every, and again, we think of a good example like a Poland, There are other countries where I think, again, we didn't talk much about it, talked to others here about Indonesia and Pakistan potentially going in the wrong direction. And then I want to sort of, the other third one real quickly that's worth mentioning is even in consolidated democracies where, again, maybe we're seeing fairly routine elections conducted, there's this concern about declining trust, right? Whether that's because of the spread of mis or disinformation, attempted efforts by foreign actors, right, to sow chaos and confusion, right, polarize and divide folks, right, as well as, frankly, the diminishing trust in sort of politicians and government officials. This sort of, even if you're running your elections well, right, lots of folks still think that the elections aren't being conducted sufficiently, and as we've seen, right, the United States, or we think about Brazil, right, the consequences can be really severe.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with you. I mean, I think I wanted to highlight two main concerns in addition to the ones that I mentioned at the beginning. But I would say two things that are our greatest concerns, or are of great concern to elections globally. One is this declining trust in credible elections, and it's often linked to the spread of disinformation. And what we have seen in our data is this very, very dangerous disconnect between what the expert data says about the strength and the credibility of an electoral system versus what people perceive as the strength, or the weaknesses rather, of the electoral system. The US is one example. The US scores very high on our expert data on the credibility and strength of the electoral system. But when you look at public perceptions of elections here in the US, less than half of the respondents in our survey had confidence in electoral integrity in the US. And here it's very divided along partisan lines. But this disconnect between expert perceptions and public perception is not just happening in the US, it's happening in a number of other countries. And actually in our report, I was really surprised to see that there are countries where this disconnect is even greater than here. Taiwan and Romania, for example, are two of the countries where the disconnect is even bigger than here in the US. And I think disinformation is playing a critical role in spreading and sowing this distrust across a number of countries. And I think that we have seen the threat and the danger of disinformation even without AI. Now, the threat of AI coming into the picture and being able to spread the disinformation at higher speed and with higher volumes, I think it poses even more of a threat. When it comes to AI, however, we haven't really seen concretely during this year of election the threat playing out and determining the outcome of an election. But we have seen how it is coming into the political discourse. And I think that we have yet to see cases where it's actually having an effect on the outcome of the election. I think that remains to be seen. So I think that to us is a critical risk and concern. And it is a concern because elections are integral to democracy. It's a core pillar. It's not a sufficient condition for democracy. Democracy needs a lot more. We've discussed a free media, respect for rights, etc., and so on. But without elections, you don't have a democracy. And so where there is distrust in election, that erodes the fundamental pillar of a democracy. And it leads not just to undermine and weaken democracy, but social cohesion generally, because it creates distrust, beyond the political system, also among people, and it increases polarization and also potentially societal unrest. So, and here there are a number of examples outside of the US. Also, Brazil is the key example where there was a lot of disinformation spread around the integrity of the electronic voting system ahead of the elections in 2022. And I think Brazil was able to avert that in a way maybe that hasn't happened in the US, where this narrative is still very much present today ahead of the elections in November. The second point that I would like to emphasize and it's very much linked also to the declining trust in elections and disinformation, but it's the decline in democratic civil discourse. And this is something that we are seeing all over the world, not just in the US, where we have also seen it going from discourse to actual translating into physical violence. And this has led to increasing harassment of election officials, but also of candidates for elections and elected political representatives. And I was looking at data. We don't generate data on this. There's no global comparative data on this, but I was looking at the data for the US. A recent Brennan Center report that says that 38% of election workers in the US have been subject to some form of harassment. 60% of those have received death threats. And I was looking at comparative data, not comparative, but data in Sweden, for example. I'm from Sweden. It's a very similar number when it comes to elected officials, actually. 30% of elected officials have been target of harassment and threats, including assassination attempts, even there, of political representatives. Mexico, they had their most violent pre-election period in Mexico's history. So this is not just a problem here in the US, but it's of great concern. I think I'll stop there. I think there are a number of things that can be done to address some of these issues, but we can talk about them later. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. So just to pick up on what's been said a bit already, I think in talking about the misinformation space, obviously there's a connection to, I think, the declining electoral participation that has been mentioned as well. There's this theory of the liar's dividend, which is that when you introduce mis or disinformation into the ecosystem, the liar not only gets some of the false information out there, but also people distrust true information more, and that I think is also part of what's the burgeoning misinformation campaigns have and disinformation campaigns have been affecting elections. I think any election problems and where the problems are most severe will be dependent on the particular system or country. And so there's no one silver bullet, but obviously this disinformation cuts across all of these issues. I will say with AI, that was mentioned, obviously a big concern. There was one incident in the Democratic primary where, as you may know, an AI-generated robocall that purported to be President Biden was sent out telling people not to vote in primary elections. So that's the type of thing that people are concerned about. I think some people are also saying, that AI, there is a little bit of a double-edged sword to it, that there may also be ways to use AI to counteract disinformation. And so, thankfully, it hasn't been as big a problem as some have as some have said it could be. But I guess we'll have to see. I would say. Also on the domestic front, going to concerns about attacks on those who are carrying out the election infrastructure that are overseeing elections. Another concern is the election officials who are in some instances or individuals that are involved with elections that are in some instances starting to put partisan views ahead of their official functions. I think, one of the salutary stories from the last election was individuals from both parties who stood on principle and said, this is what the data shows, this is how the election came out. There are concerns this time that some of the structures being established in places like Georgia are that some individuals may already have thoughts about what they intend to say about the election. There's concerns about pressure on these individuals to come out one way or another. So I think that is also a concern. In the misinformation, disinformation sense, I will go a little bit of way into possible solutions that I know that Annika has some ideas as well. I think that bolstering education is number one, so that people can spot these types of issues. I think going back to press issues, particularly in the United States, I think one of the big concerns in the United States is the deterioration and elimination of local media. Not only because they can really shine a light on local issues better, because they know the players, they know the ground there, but also because they tend to be more trusted by local individuals. And when you're talking about lack of trust in the electoral processes, you have to have believable and trusted interlocutors that are telling you, this was fine, this election was fine, your vote was counted, there was no tampering with machines. Now, that doesn't have to be journalists, although it's helpful. It can also be, your local party official. It can be your local secretary of state or a local election official if you trust them. So educating people and having those information sources available on the ground. I also think that governments, need to work with social media companies to the extent that this misinformation, disinformation is distributed across social media, to find ways that within proper boundaries of freedom of speech and things like that, will find ways such as labeling that allow people to more easily identify sources of information and be able to take that into account when they are assessing particular parts of information. And then the final thing I'll say is, civil society being able to set up fact-checking resources that individuals can use when they see some piece of information and wondering, is it really true that X, Y, and Z, being able to go to a source that is credible, established by civil society to say, there's this rumor going around and it's not true. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you all. Now we're gonna open it up for questions. So if anyone has any questions in the audience, now's your chance. Great, let's go here first. I think we should be fine without the microphone, but just project.
Thank you for doing this panel. My question, I guess, is a bit of a comparative politics question between the U.S. and internationally. So I think one of my concerns here in the U.S. is polarization between those that want to uphold democracy, like the people in this room, and those who have, either serious or potentially, politically motivated concerns about our democratic processes. And to some of your points earlier, don't have trust in the democratic system. So I'm wondering internationally, to what extent and how should we engage with these people who don't have trust in democratic systems and question the very notions of our democracies, when we have this kind of like self-selection polarization going on here in the US?
I'll start. I'm sure that my co-panelists have interesting ideas. I think that in part it goes back to what I was just talking about. The medium is the message. I mean, I think that there are some people that distrust electoral process, and to sort of level set, people distrust the electoral process for all sorts of different reasons as well. Some people think it's corrupt. Some people think that their view will never matter. Some people are just, not interested. But over and over again, I think we see that people, it matters who is talking to them. And finding people within their communities that they trust to relay the message about the reliability of elections, the importance of elections, and that sort of thing is important. And that requires, talking domestically, bipartisan or cross-partisan communication in relation to elections, and that civil discourse, which was described earlier, that can say, we can, getting a bunch of people in the room to say, we can disagree on every underlying principle under the sun, but we should agree that, this is how elections should be carried out so that votes really matter, and that, if you lose this election, you'll have another opportunity to present your case to the people at the following election, going back to this cyclical nature.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's also a very difficult question to answer, but I want to compliment what you said, Andrew. I mean, polarization is a driver of a lot of the challenges that we are seeing to democracy around the world, and we have seen an increase in polarization the world over. I looked at VDEM data. It's an academic institution in Gothenburg that produces data on a number of democratic indicators, and their polarization data is really interesting. I think that polarization has increased in the past 10 years by 200% or something like that. And in the US, if you compare the US to those global trends, it has increased as well, but it has increased twice as much as the rest of the world. So the global trend that we are seeing is turbocharged in the case of the US. And there are a number of reasons why that happens, not least the electoral system and the two-party system has something to do with it as well, but it's much more complex than that. I think what can be done to counter and reduce levels of polarization, I wish I knew and I had a silver bullet for that. There isn't a simple answer, but I think that there is an important role to play for elected representatives and public figures to help reduce levels of polarization in the discourse that they use and the messages that they put out. I think they have a huge influence over voters and over people and over citizens and non-citizens. So they have a very important responsibility. I think also, in the longer term, and civic education, the education system also has a role to play in terms of fostering democratic values and emphasizing the importance of discourse and civil democratic discourse. I think something that we have seen in other countries as well, I don't know how effective it is, but it's something that is interesting to look at. And actually, our organization, International ID, has played an important role in helping political parties develop codes of conduct. One very important one was just put out for ahead of the EU elections this year. And we actually, through broad alliances across the political spectrum, all political party groups in the EU Parliament actually ended up adhering to this code of conduct, which includes a number of elements, including respectful behavior, even against political opponents, committing to not spreading disinformation, etc., etc. And I think what was really hopeful is that all political parties, even the ones that sometimes in practice don't use a very civil democratic discourse, signed up to it. Now, there's no enforcement related to it or sanctions for those that don't abide by it, but I think it sends an important message. Let me see if... I think that there's some examples here in the US and in other countries, also small experiences. Now I don't remember what it's called, but it's where you bring people together in the same room to discuss across political boundaries. And actually, those experiences have shown that when you actually talk in person together about issues that you care about, you increase understanding of different opinions. So that's difficult to scale up because it requires in-person small groups, but it can make a difference, at least at the micro level. I'll stop there.
I think my colleagues covered a lot of the terrain, but I think one example of what, just to piggyback on what Annika was talking about, I think it's Braver Angels that's doing that. And I would also put a plug in. I think PBS this Friday has something called Deadlock, which would be interesting because it's got an interesting cross-section of folks, right? You've got Adrian Fontes, Secretary of State of Arizona, Chris Kobach, right, from Kansas, Gabriel Sterling, and it's being moderated by a law professor that's written on sort of similar issues, who previously clerked for Justice Sotomayor, and I think it sort of gets at this sort of notion, and so, perhaps there's sort of something there. I think, no, but I think this is a really complex question. I do think, just to sort of go a little bit further to sort of Annika's point, I do think there's some structural things. It's not the only game in town, but that are worth sort of taking, right, a real sort of careful look at here in the States. I mean, we know, and again, the U.S. isn't by itself, but there are international standards on what redistricting and boundary lines look like, and we're not anywhere near them here in the United States, right? We sort of have a two-party system, and part of what makes things a little different now, I don't know how many people went to the talk that Mark Penn gave last night at sort of GW School of Political Management, but sort of talked about is, there are more incentives for folks, right, with a couple exceptions, to sort of play to their base, right? There are some members of Congress that, as an example, New York Republicans that signed on to sort of, free and fair elections and put aside the president's rhetoric, but even that bipartisan resolution was pretty thin on the bipartisan side of it. And so I think, I think there are some questions around, again, the sort of the electoral college piece. There are some questions around some of the sort of the structural pieces. There are even some questions, frankly, around, and I want to be careful on how I say this as a former election official who, again, thinks elections are pretty well run, but there are ways in which we do it differently that are potentially problematic, including, right, the sort of having folks who are elected to office overseeing them, which, even if the elections are run well, can raise questions for some folks about how those elections are subsequently carried out. And we've seen that, in past elections. And so I think, that's sort of, something to sort of be mindful of. Again, and this isn't super academic, but I also think it's just worth noting. I mean, there are also just some other things that are, really important to note. One is a lot of people right now, I think it's important to distinguish between folks who perhaps have who have a false impression about how elections work, who don't know better, which personally I happen to think is a large chunk of people, versus people who sit higher up who do know better, who have a larger following. And in spite of the fact that there's been accountability in a few respects for certain attorneys, right? And I'm okay to name them, an Eastman, a Giuliani, right? There hasn't been enough of that kind of thing. And for those that put their necks out, I think of Stephen Risher in Maricopa County. He, of course, lost the primary, which sort of raises the question about whether, Maricopa County Republican, right, which raises the question about how politically, right, beneficial this sort of is. You would like to believe that doing the right thing could also sort of pay politically, but the political incentives in many cases aren't sort of lining up. And there's real, and there are not some of this, there's just not, there's a lot of division right now about basic things like protections for those who are administering our elections, which, notwithstanding the fact that there are other countries where these issues are at play, to my mind, generally it is not as seen as for those folks, right, the referees, if you will, is quite as polarizing. And so those are some sort of examples. I think the things on the sort of going forward, I think is, really important. I mean, I do believe that there needs to be sort of greater capacity, right, to be able to sort of protect people who are trying to do this kind of work. I mean, one thing we haven't touched on is, yes, there's an election task force here in the United States that's dedicated to prosecutions. They're not super big, and even if they were really big and fully, they had all the resources in the world, you're not going to prosecute your way out of this situation. So I think that's, one piece. I think there's also, again, this accountability piece. It's worth noting that, in certain battleground states, the chief election officials in many cases are not right. In 2022, the election deniers lost, but there are lots of places where election deniers are sort of strongholds where, again, there needs to sort of, yes, if there's legal election sabotage, there's got to be legal accountability. There needs to be political accountability for those that are putting, again, their political interests ahead of free and fair elections. If you're getting out of the Electronic Registration Information Center, which helps ensure that your rolls are clean, and you're getting out of it, but you don't generally have a good reason for doing so. And so I think that's something to be mindful of too. So.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add one point? I think also, talking about election deniers, it's incumbent on both parties to officials running domestically here in the U.S. to say, that they also have standards about who they are willing to support even within their own party. It comes back to elections as a form of accountability, but setting some baselines about who gets to be supported as a party candidate in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. I think we had another hand, yep.
Yeah, I wanted to first thank you all for taking this time today to talk to us. But my question was, you guys mentioned more like direct types of like election interference and election influence. But it seemed recently that a lot of these anti-democratic actors or wannabe autocrats have started to like adapt strategies and policies from each other, like cross-country. And I'm not an expert on Europe, but I think we see some of that there. But especially in places like Africa, we've seen some more direct stuff with like Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger also like directly, working together on these things. I wanted to just ask, like, is that a threat that we're seeing increase, and what are the best ways to combat that as these anti-democratic actors are starting to kind of work together across like country lines in some way to further like collectively?
Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and indeed we're seeing increasing collaboration among autocracies and among anti-democratic actors in different countries, and I think it becomes even more important in that context when we're seeing greater alliances between non-democratic actors for democratic actors and democratic countries to, on the other hand, create strong alliances to counter that collaboration that we see on the autocratic side. And I know it's not a perfect initiative, but President Biden had an initiative starting in 2021 with the Summits for Democracy. That was one attempt to bring together democracies of different kinds from all over the world into an alliance to counter the authoritarian trend. 3 summits for democracy were held. The 2 first were hosted by the US. The second one was hosted in collaboration with other countries to broaden the ownership beyond the US. And the third one was hosted by South Korea. I think it might not be perfect. There were a lot of weaknesses in that initiative, and that countries were not mandated to make commitments to defend democracy at home or abroad. A lot of countries didn't show up for the summit, but it is an important attempt, at least, to bring democracies together, to collaborate. And I think, international idea on a much smaller scale, we only have 35 member states, but we try to encourage that also among the countries that are members of international idea. They have committed to certain democratic values, both at home and also upholding them abroad. And so we try to encourage greater collaboration and exchange of experiences to strengthen those alliances in the democratic world.
Any additional thoughts or any final thoughts, since we are, I believe, at time, so if you want to add any finishing thoughts as well.
I cannot bear the burden of final thoughts. I'll leave that to my colleagues who are much more versed in this, but I'll just add onto what was just said. Obviously, part of that discussion is also that democracy's ability to promote democracy abroad becomes more difficult as their own democracies are at least seen to be wavering. And so when someplace like the United States has an insurrection around electoral vote counting, and then goes abroad to tell other countries democracy is what you should be working for, they might look at us and say, well, that didn't look so great, and you say you have a democracy. And so that's where accountability for these sorts of things comes in, and making sure that having a strong democracy at home promotes your ability to have a strong democracy abroad, and also that we're seeing authoritarian nations gain strength around the world, and in many places they would, in almost all instances, they would much prefer to operate with other countries who are led by authoritarian leaders. And so their interest in promoting those types of governments abroad is also rising at the same time. And so I think that's another factor that's leading to this phenomenon that you were observing. Stop.
Yeah, great. Any additional thoughts? Any final thoughts?
I hope this sort of, this conversation, I think, puts into some perspective, I think, the battle that's being waged, right, between autocracy and democracy, notwithstanding the fact that that's perhaps rhetoric that you've heard from sort of certain political officials. I think this, it's a very real challenge. And I think it's really important, too. One of the reasons why I'm so appreciative that you guys have come out is that there's something each of us can do. And not only is there something each of us can do, but it has a bearing and impact sort of on all of us, right? I think that, there is no sort of country that has a monopoly, as we now, of course, know pretty well at this point, but even we could have gone back further in time, but we certainly know now on sort of healthy, robust democracy. But we, sort of Andrew's point, right, have a role to play. And I think even for those of you that may be thinking about pursuing a career that has little to do with this, right? We've heard, if you don't have a robust, strong democracy, which starts in part with sort of free and fair election, the business climate in which you operate in, we've now, I think, name-checked Hungary on a few occasions, so why not go there again, right, becomes really problematic. It becomes really, really fragile. And if you're sort of thinking that other people, right, are going to sort of take care of this, I think, that's unfortunate, because I think, as we can sort of see now, there are autocratic actors in democracies, right? Fragile democracies, and those, of course, are backsliding. And so, I think it sort of, hopefully this conversation's given you some sort of fodder on sort of where we currently are, where there have been some successes, and what we need to do to sort of further bolster democracy, so that that's perhaps the preferred form of government, right, for more and more countries going forward.
Maybe my final word would be go and vote. I'm not American, I can't vote here, but my kids are, and my oldest son is 19, and I'm encouraging him to go to vote for the first time in his life. Even though a lot of people are disengaging from electoral processes and losing trust in elections for different reasons, a lot of the statistics that we saw, a lot of the people that are in those 10% decline in voter turnout are young people. instead they go out on the streets, they express their political views in different ways, elections will still remain the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. So use that right, use it wisely, and don't forget to register. The deadline is coming up soon.
Yes. Perfect, thank you. And also, Election Day is a holiday at the university, so there's no excuse to not vote. All right, please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers for their expert thoughts.